Well, good morning for those of us in Canada, and good afternoon for those of us in Europe. We're here to talk about the fact that companies have, or business leaders in particular, often have visions that are very difficult to communicate to their employees, particularly in medium to large size companies. A second aspect of that is that companies are often actively disengaging their employees without being aware of it, simply not being aware of what's coming, what they're saying, and the impact it's having on their employees. My name is Donna Jones, and I'm the host for today. I run the Evolutionary Provocateur podcast on managementissues.com. And with me today is Guido Palazzo, who is the ethics professor at the University Business School for University of Lausanne, HEC Lausanne. Guido's done a lot of research into the effect of ethics on companies, good and bad ethics, that is. Not and so what we're going to talk about today is how can companies actually use the soft power of storytelling to inspire engagement. So I'm going to turn it over to Guido, and let's just jump into the conversation. Guido, let's start with the first question. What kinds of stories are leaders using now in business, in their companies today, that are actually having the effect of doing the opposite of what they hope for?
Well, what we have to understand first is that the way we speak as leaders has an impact not only on what the others understand, but also what they do. And the way we speak reveals something about what we believe about the world. And if you want to understand decision making in organizations, there's one simple thing: the decisions we make are most of the time driven by the beliefs we hold and by the values we hold. These are most of the time unconscious, but the decisions reveal these values and beliefs. And if you ask yourself, how do you get to these values and beliefs? The answer is, listen to the stories that people share, listen to the stories that dominate the discourse in a certain context, like a corporation. And the discourse that is happening in corporations is, since a few decades, dominated by the shareholder value maximization ideology, which is basically building on the beliefs that free markets are the ideal, property rights are the main value, greed is good, and the more greedy we are as individuals, the better, because the market will transform this into welfare for everyone. So this is a very strong belief system, and it does a lot of harm in organizations because it destroys a lot of motivation of people to have a more visionary idea about their role in corporations and beyond.
I agree, and one of the things that comes to mind is that companies are actively engaging the intellect, but they're not engaging the full horsepower that an employee brings to work because of that issue. The other thing that I've noticed, and perhaps you've seen this in your work as well, is that the idea of fulfilling shareholder value sits very separate from employee engagement. For some reason, those dots don't get connected, and so there's just a focus on one or the other.
Yeah, just imagine one of the key questions that many companies are facing at the moment. They realize, and they get pushed to that through NGOs, that at some point in their supply chain, human rights are violated. There might be slaves working somewhere in their supply chain. And now, being pressured to do something about it, you can have two frames to look at this. The first frame might be, if you ask yourself, why should I do something as a leader in my organization about slaves? The first could be, well, if we have slaves and we get pressure, this destroys our reputation and we have financial losses. Or you could say, well, there should be no slaves in the world, and I don't want to be linked to this kind of harm, and I feel ashamed about it, and we have to change that. We want to be a corporation that is not violating human rights. And you see, if you link it to profit, you can imagine that this is not very interesting, very inspiring to your people. If you want to make a change, especially with regards to sustainability, you need a broader perspective. You need a narrative that goes beyond the simplistic idea of, does it bring us more money if we do A, B, or C?
Well, that takes us to the idea of a longer-term vision. I appreciate those points because it really helps to illustrate the choice that any company, any business leader has. We either do what's intelligent in terms of human potential worldwide, or we buy into a fear of not being successful if we do. So, the fear-based decision making is problematic overall. So let's switch it to the long-term vision and take a look at that, because companies that frame their capacity to survive, and we sometimes use the words sustainability and survival in the same sentence, but I think they're quite different mindsets. But they use there's a bit of a lack of a long-term logic or a long-term horizon. And then, of course, the rationalization for not having one is we need to make the next quarter. We need to be financially viable, and it's a difficult conundrum. How does this work out for you? Like, what have you observed about that dynamic in companies?
If you again look at the question of how do companies understand sustainability or responsibility along their operations, and you have a company that has this combination of short-term thinking pushed by financial markets and profit maximization as the only responsibility, what you get out of this is a very simplistic idea of corporate responsibility. They might even accept certain responsibilities, but only under the condition that it somehow in the short term contributes something to them as well. The best example for this is Michael Porter's concept of creating shared value, which is, in a nutshell, arguing that a company should engage in sustainability projects because these projects not only solve problems, also contribute to the profits of the company. So it's a win-win situation, shared value. The problem with this story is that, first, it is very convincing to companies. That's not the problem part, because it's written in their logic, in their thinking. The problem comes if you ask yourself, what about all these challenges out there that you cannot translate so easily into a win for the corporation? If I go back to my example of slavery, I'm sure that all the cocoa producers that have slaves in their chains, because they all do, ask themselves, would we make more money if we have less slaves? The answer would be, of course not, because slaves are cheap. Abolishing slavery is maybe something in a highly complex country like Ivory Coast, for instance, shaken by civil war, is a project that takes you 10, 20 years. You need a long-term time horizon. You will never be able, in the short term, to translate your engagement into a shared value project. You will never be able to calculate a win for yourself. The only win that you get is your people feel better if you do not have slaves. You have a broader vision that motivates people inside the organization and pacifies maybe the pressures from outside. But translating this into money is very, very difficult. So we have to go beyond this what's in for me logic. I do not deny that there is a profit potential in all these engagements, but it can never be the first question. If it's the first question, it is too simplistic.
Well, it's interesting for me because there's two things that come to mind. First of all, Chris Laszlo wrote on shared value in 2004, so he started writing about that long before Michael Porter picked it up. And when I spoke with Chris about the conversation we were going to have, what he basically said is we need to refresh that whole conversation again. We're at that point where it needs to be relooked at. The second thing that comes to mind, just to comment on what you just said, is that when you just look at a narrow frame of logic, you can only see that if we don't use, the shortcut thinking goes, the simplistic thinking, as you say, is if we don't use slaves, then we don't make less money. But if you operate with a wider lens and you see the bigger picture, you make far more money. We've got high-performing companies worldwide that demonstrate that repeatedly, and it's ethical. And it's also intelligent. It's ethical integrity pays off for them. Their performance is outstanding, and I think Joseph Bragdon's work illustrates that with the lampindex.com in his book Profit for Life. So anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about how leaders can craft their stories to better engage people. How can they use stories as a more effective tool for inspiring engagement?
What we know is that powerful stories are building on values. And if you ask yourself what kind of values could that be, there are two types of values basically. There are so-called extrinsic values and intrinsic values. Extrinsic values are, for instance, hedonic pleasure or career achievements or power. Intrinsic values are autonomy over my life, benevolence, empathy for others, justice. And if you look at research on values shows two things. First of all, it shows that there's a very strong correlation between holding or activating intrinsic values and sustainable behavior and integrity, and between extrinsic values and corruption and unsustainable behavior. So if the first thing, if we want to craft a powerful story that moves away from this too simplistic thinking, is it has to build on intrinsic values. The second thing we learn from research is that extrinsic values crowd out intrinsic values. So the more you pay bonuses to people for doing their job, the less they will be internally motivated. So we have to craft a story that is building on on intrinsic values. Just to give you an example of such a very powerful story, the Roman Empire that held for 1,000 years was building like the one of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome. And what these stories transported in their core was the key value of the Roman society, which was dignitas, dignity, the dignity of Rome. And it held for 1,000 years. So we have to ask ourselves, if we want to have a vision of the future that transforms very strong consumer and managerial decision-making habits towards more sustainability, how can we craft that story building on a different set of values than the stories that we had so far that drove capitalism to that point?
Interesting. Is there one simple self-awareness tool that leaders can use to help pay attention to what stories they're telling now?
A tool in what sense?
Well, just something that helps them, a way for them to observe the effect of what they're doing currently.
Well, what I always propose to leaders is have a look at how different companies frame their own engagement in sustainability. And then you will find two groups. You will find a group that is very ticking the box, engineering, facts and figures oriented. And you will have companies that have a large vision, that show where they want to go, that connect their own activities to a broader debate. Like, for instance, Patagonia. Patagonia is connecting its own sustainability engagement to the larger debate on degrowth, on less consumption, on saving resources, on providing better starting conditions for future generations. Or the Unilever CEO, Paul Pullman, who has developed a very broad vision for his company to move towards sustainability. So what I believe is that the most effective narratives that we can craft are narratives that are disruptive with the practices so far, because that's what we need. We need disruptive innovations to move out of this unsustainable situation.
Now, is disruptive innovation then the doorway for a company to truly embody their story, to become a better story?
It's the first step. Well, you need these disruptive visions, but it has to be connected, first of all, to action. If you use a narrative as a CEO, for instance, that is in contrast to what people inside the organization and outside the organization perceive you doing, then the only thing you create is cynicism. You have to align what you do with this narrative. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that if we want to have a transformative effect, move towards a different society, one company's activities or narrative is too small. So we have, as Patagonia does, as Unilever does, connect our own narrative to the broader societal discourse on change. And we have to do this in a way that we can connect also to other actors not necessarily in the same industry, not necessarily even corporations, but actors who are also motivated by a similar vision. Because if we can connect, we have a broad dynamic, and that will drive the change.
Now, where can people go for more information on your work?
Well, if you want to know more about my ideas on storytelling. There's a TED Talk that you can listen to, and there are a few articles that are available on the internet on the SSRN website,
All right, I
or they
want
can contact me.
to contact you directly, and how would they do that? Is there an
They would do
email?
this probably via email.
And through HGC Lausanne.
Yes.
Yeah. I want to thank you for our conversation today. I think there's a number of thoughts in here for companies, not the least of which, picking up off your last point, is that there's an opportunity for some really unusual partnerships to emerge, which are really bonded by a shared vision, capacity to look down the horizon and recognize that sustainable is just not possible as long as you're focusing on the quarterly profit. So thank you again for joining me. Any last thoughts you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, maybe this one point, that this is the moment. The change is occurring out there. It has to occur. We all understand that this system cannot continue, so we have to act now.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.